Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Western European banners, standards and other flags in the 14th and 15th centuries. We will look at other parts of Europe and also of course beyond the old continent in other videos, but it's important to go by step by step as always, because nothing is really so simple as it sounds. Right, today's video in fact is going to be relatively basic, in order to identify a sort of hierarchy and specific function of each of these types of flags that, as you know, on the battlefield but also outside of it, were of incredible importance for military as well as political reasons. They had always a specific functionality that is not entirely clear, in as much we do not know, of course, everything about those words at so many levels in combat, in tactics, in strategy, etc. So it's not fully clear all the time. The factorial quantity of these flags, for example, on the battlefield, right, in combat, when was definitely a great mess all around, dust, generally disconcerting sight, hearing, etc. And the flag would rise to function as a meeting point when falling, of course, was really meaning bad news, because it means at least that the unit that was using it had been knocked out at the very core, right? Because of course the flag had an enormously spiritual meaning that today we will not look at. We will see it in another bit. Today we appreciate the difference of all the various flags: the banner, the standard, the pennons, the pennoncelles, the ensigns, etc. How they were made concretely, because that's also something that changed over time. So we will see this at some point also for the previous centuries. The late Middle Ages, as you know, witnesses an increasing level of uniformation, of standardization organically, in terms of tactical specialties and the articulation of such functionalities. And so the system, in other words, is getting more complex and complicated, and these instruments are ever, in fact, more different in order to work within this system. Right. Today we will not also look at the passage, let's say, from the feudal type of warfare to the truly modern one, at least the pike squared one of the Swiss. That would be the basis, as you know, for the further development, etc. The functions were pretty much the same, but still combat was going to be very different, and so also the use of flags to some degree. We will analyze here mostly like the feudal background, right? And as you know, there is a playlist about literally medieval heraldry, even though it was mostly a modern history thing rather than medieval. Flags, banners, etc. Because as someone may say, well, I don't really care that much about this stuff because I prefer, I don't know, armor, arms, tactics, etc. And I understand that because I also don't study this on a normal basis, and there is also fascination maybe with symbolism that mostly encompasses the heraldic side of the story. All the pictures uploaded today, for example, are very beautiful to watch. And if you like the Middle Ages, of course, they're quite entertaining and somehow hypnotic to watch, which is also what I count, frankly, on when I upload them here for the viewers to stick around longer. But that's not, of course, that's obvious. But I just like to show them for showing what that word really was. It was one of the most colorful that you can imagine. But the tactical function of flags was radical, enormous. We will have to make a video especially about the statutes of Templars, that are one of the most overlooked sources about that, showing at that point, at the peak of nightly warfare the vital importance of flags, right? In properly coordinating the movements, not just, of course, this is something we've seen becoming ever more important at different levels of uniformation of the military clothing. I made a bit about Gustavus Adolphus colored regiments, so-called, because they started to uniform at that point, and that kind of color. I also made a video about some late medieval actual uniformation of military clothing, which was also a thing. Again, uniformation had always been there by some degree, right? It didn't begin at a given point in time. But of course, the purpose of the flag, elementarily, being that you must show where, again, the coordinates of that unit lays in combat. So again, in an incredibly messed up situation, so that you can fundamentally revert to it, things go worse. This would require a digression on how tactics, especially at this point in history, that had changed somehow from, say, for example, the great peak of medieval civilization in the 13th and the early 14th, right? There wasn't actually a greater system until the time of the pikes. Where there were also something, however, relatively, say, simpler at that point, and that's also why they had, say, simpler things in war are also the hardest, right? And so that is obvious if you consider how much training collectively it requires to make something like pike square work, for example. So there are all considerations that we will be able to do only in the moment in which we'll have dealt with every single battle possible and say, okay, well, look here, we can start finding a pattern or whatever. Today we stick to the category, explaining what is a banner, right? What's the difference with a standard, etc. And we start, in fact, exactly from this. Always bear in mind another concept, that the names of these flags, of course, in the medieval sources, belong to a pre-Linnean, non-encyclopedistic time and categorization. Just like for weapons or anything else, a name doesn't mean necessarily the same thing, right? In order to understand also, of course, which type of flag we're talking about, we should always be able to associate it to the type of organic unit that in that sense was tending to uniform. That is to say, I remember some passages in my work where the sources said, that they saw this Pennons cells, for example, and they knew that in that case, I don't know, this 25 infantrymen were behind that. They could make it a rapid count mathematically. That's also a thing, aside from those chances where you want to try to trick the enemy. But consistently, it's less often than not to count how many troops, who they are, etc. So terminology can vary wildly, right? Also, a variety of different types of flag were in use throughout this era, right? And they had each own, of course, their particular function, right? So they weren't there by chance, right? It's mostly our historical ignorance that prevents us from realizing what they were there for, but they always had a specific function, and very often a very concrete and life-saving one, right? Or for everyone involved, life-killing for that matter, just considering the tactical effects that sticking to this means of to this signals was really the case. I'll think about armor at some point being made lighter, especially helmets, to favor more view and hearing, right? Because it was more important to see flags and to hear orders than avoiding having, a sword stuck in your brain, right? So of course that was tried to be avoided as well, and of course that was not the only concern. Everything was calibrated for a cost-benefit ratio that was very pragmatic and rational, also for other reasons. In any case, the basic distinction that we can make on the two principal types is the one between the banner and the standard. Right? The banner was the flag of a knight banneret. That is the guy who could essentially bear his coat of arms. Right? He was a knight who had the privilege of leading his own group of soldiers, and as a consequence carrying a battle flag of his own called the banner. The etymology of which is in fact from the same one of band, right, throughout the various European languages that indicated exactly this specific aspect, that the, say, more compact unit under somebody's control was the one under a banner, right, because of this connection. And to become a knight banneret, a knight had to be appointed by the king or another higher-ranking noble. This title was usually granted to knights who demonstrated honorable conduct, bravery in battle, of course. So this crucial capacity of command, right? And in addition to leading his own group of soldiers, a knight banneret also had the right to grant knighthood to other men who distinguished themselves in battle, right? This banneret was a knight who led a company of troops during time of war under his own banner. Again, as we will see here, it was of specific proportion, tendentially squared, and the military rank of the banneret was higher than, for example, one of a knight bachelor who fought instead under someone else's banner, but lower than the, say, the higher nobility, like earls, dukes, etc. Down to the early 14th century, that is the peak of the medieval art of war, the banner was twice as tall as it was broad, right? So while here I don't have data on the variation on absolute size, it seems that the function of the banner was the one of being high up, right? It was developing in height rather, and so this fits the general picture that, say, at an organic level, it wouldn't everything was in part remaining the same as far as the basic organic units within armies before and after the mid 14th century crisis, right? But the sense that companies at some point could also be larger and that they were coordinated by a single guy on the field was something more frequent, at least in the case of the bannerets, right? And consider that cavalry warfare has a properly in the amount of cavalry available at that point, really a great impact, right? So the necessity of these being the leaders, being seen at an important distance, having is in proportion likely greater than it would be in later times, where the battlefield actually becomes a bit more complicated, right? Armies become also more fragmented because the smaller in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the smaller the forces, let's say, the more tactical, exploit you can carry out, right? So instead, the sense of being seen from the distance was important, likely also an increased amount of speed. Battlefields were larger, right? Were much more based on infantry, on direct, say, face-to-face cavalry charges that would be later, right? So while it is true that towards probably the later, say, the second half of the 15th century would be a significant strengthening, a bit of even of the size of the units, etc. These were becoming also a bit more infantry-based. They were, as a consequence, becoming also a bit less. They were still bulky as a consequence. So even if they were actually more maneuverable infantry-wise, they weren't quite as cavalry had been in the past, right? And these are the ideas that I think are behind this change. we see, in fact, that as the 14th century progresses, which is the one in which there is the sharpest contraction, at least through contemporary illustrations, because very often these banners were made also of course, organic material that would the parish wouldn't have an enormous, of course, archaeological evidence. It's clear that the proportions change to 1/2 to 1, right? So it became generally square by the mid-15th century at the latest, which is what we were saying before, right? At that point, we see it clearly. Then from there was a further change, but that's how medieval warfare, say in the age of the Burgundian ordinances, the Venetian conduct, etc., were basically about this. And as you know, we're talking mostly about armies revolving around an important nucleus of heavy cavalry that, as sizable as could be in certain circumstances, was also a bit less, let's say, collectively cooperating in larger maneuvers than had been, the great cavalry charges of the 13th century, the largest European battlefields, such as, Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, right? These are the big, we're talking about thousands of knights fighting against one another at a time. And also in a lighter fashion, right? Consider that men-at-arms became heavier, of course, over time, so there was all this sort of less wielding capacity that was still coming in parallel, as we just said, to sort of more individualistic type of warfare, as far as smaller armies can also perform more complex or less predictable moves on the battlefield. But overall, the sense that now the most important thing was to rather identify the unit rather than chasing it, right? In this context, becomes more even, because the guys are also bulkier, heavier, right? And they operate with this increasing retinue of infantry that gets ever more specialized, and to fight in that sort of unit that had to preserve itself as a sort of a monad on the battlefield, right? So the banner was made of expensive material, richly embroidered, right? It was actually the most important of the flags, as you have realized. It was either stiffened with a back ram or had a batten along its top edge, right? It had to be resistant, of course. And during the 15th century, it also came to be fringed, usually in the principal metal and principal color of the arms, probably to be ever more visible for the aforementioned reasons, together with the squaring, right? In battle, the banner was carried by a trusted knight or squire of the banneret's retinue, who thus was normally sticking around the banneret, and so the commander. That's the reason why this thing fell, right? It was really just like most flags, just bad news. And the men holding this banner were normally chosen, like throughout all military history, ensign bearers, for their prowess, right? The sense is that the commander was in theory to be the strongest of all the warriors there. Naturally, lots of things are changing. We have made multiple videos about late medieval armies and how, of course, there is a sort of not death of cavalry, but that it's not really what happened, and that as a PhD in medieval warfare, I actually tend to reject sharply, right? Especially throughout the 14th and the first half of the 15th century. And in relative terms also later, by the way. But of course it was possible that these leaders were not necessarily great commanders themselves. We're still in a time in which old leaders have to be warriors of some kind, but you know that towards the thresholds of the modern age, of course armies become an ever, say, more important thing from a politically unitary way. So the leader is at some point preserved. This is not the case. There is also a more traditional, say, just as an explanation, there is a more traditional sense of why, of course, it was a guy in second, not even in command, but just assisting the commander, because of course the former had to be just the epitome of military vision, etc., authority, command, etc. This second one was to be provided with, say, the inspiring capacity to distinguish himself, to be reliable, to be the guy that is going to maintain this banner no matter what. We have the case of some banner holders that died on their horseback, still keeping, after they were dead, the banner in their hands, standing, because that was the single most important thing. There were people who had their arms cut, right, to make the banner fall, and this kind of things. And this happened. Think about the centurion and the signifary in the Roman army, right? The sense that there was a hierarchy for which he bore the ensign. It was a sort of alter ego of the same commander, especially in the case of the banneret, that, as we've seen, had his own coat of arms there, and that was collectively ruling over these other knights, by the way. So people who were not just equal, they were to anyone, they were already elite themselves, was just to follow in the commander's retinue, rather than, of course, being just chosen for a province in itself. But that was the point, right? That only the best ones could follow the commander, also in melee, and being trusted to defend their banner with their life, fundamentally. There is a source about the Battle of Azincourt in which Henry V is said to have, quote, committed the bearing of the standards and banners and other ensigns to such men as he knew to be of great strength and prowess in the bearing of them. Consider that these guys were all in armor, so already the level of athleticism required is enormous. They are fighting on horseback. They are really, most of the times, they are, in this sense, loaded with an extra task in some of the most dangerous and places of responsibility, right, during the battle. The standard was instead, during this period, at least, a long tapering flag with a pointed or rounded tail or tails, right? The field was in the owner's livery colors, and instead of heraldry, it carried his personal badges and motto. We have seen it in the videos about the Battle of Tewkesbury, etc. That was important, especially during the Wars of the Roses, to identify who was who, because the entire point of that war was to knock out the single guy for dynastic purposes. So it was a matter of identification, also of bravery, to say, let him come at that point, and of course not trying to hide themselves, etc., which was a big deal. Throughout the history of knightly warfare, there had been a great deal also of tricks, of stratagems, ruses, etc., even to exchanging arms, certain units faking to be others, such as, squires camouflaged as knights in some way to sacrifice themselves, tricking the enemy into thinking they had run into an actual battle instead. There was another behind. This flank attacks. Think about Charles of Anjou at Tagliacozzo. This kind of tricks that were generally obscured by the so-called official historiography, that were, however, pretty much out there. So the seemingly trend seems to diminish, not because this was, let's say mindset was becoming fairer in that regard, or more idealistic regarding these things, but there were literally less opportunities and less at stake, right? Also, in many ways, during this period, yes, you still have national monarchic struggles, such as like one of the 100 Years' War, etc., but the type of war is hardly ever decided anymore by a single engagement. Like in the previous centuries, a greater concentration of forces could really do, right? This has never been the medieval thing compared to other eras in particular. But definitely the fact that, especially with the mid-14th century crisis, the nobility had affirmed itself now for good at a certain level, and that there was also more of a sense of that point of negotiate between this, in fact, peers. And still, as we've seen, the individual exploit on a battlefield considered on the basis very often of these units more individually is something that may have led to the greater consideration of Wu was Wu in a bit more of an articulated way compared to before. And this aspect of the standard is fascinating because while at first the standard was not carried in battle, instead being confined to camp where it was fixed, during the second half of the 14th century, it began to appear on the battlefield too. Perhaps because it's been suggested again the simplicity of its colors and devices made it more immediately recognizable in the heat of battle than the by then often complicated quarterings and sub-quarterings of the armorial banner. That were getting ever more complicated. Why? Because of this hierarchization, this affirmation of dynasties over the lesser knights. So it's not that before things were, say, less complicated, but knights were more, as we've seen, and in relative terms, thus less important. Right now, the standard could definitely identify those big shots that were within the army, at least at some level, because the time of the enormous armies was really relatively over, right? And there was this increase in value of the single leader and retinue behind him, and in a time in which these people were just more in charge than the people that had existed before. You see, medieval Europe in the 11th century could be more about that individual struggle, the individual knight compared to the 13th century. But there were so many of them that could not, however, be gathered all together so easily on the battlefield. In the 13th century, you have instead exactly this. And then from the mid-14th century onwards, you have, again, fewer knights, but that don't have such powerful, say, other people in between them and, say, the average soldier, which is fascinating because these guys again become the hardcore, what would be the ancien regime, and more or less they were more considered now given these oscillations in politics as in war. And definitely the standard was acquiring this immediate greater importance, let's say. As we observed, the banner was, as we've seen, a greater privilege, but the standard would become more important tactically to recognize the guy. In fact, it's probably with this change of emphasis in mind that Barry Harold wrote, who evaluated these things, as you know, much around 14, 15, 16, same time as Azincourt, quote, in heraldry, banners are more noble than standards, but in battles and expeditions, standards are more noble than banners, right? Because of course they function better. They were the ones who were traditionally felt to be delivering the actual spirit, right, and control on the battlefield. So the banner was a bit like the ceremonial, I say ceremonial not in the sense that it was just used in ceremonies. They were always present on the battlefield. Then I mean a bit more the formal, chic thing to show up, right, for a sense like that's my official banner. But the standard is also the one that actually makes the fight in the former's stead. Right, so this is to be appreciated as far also as the function of the guy that broke the standard, meaning that, as we've seen, this was a tapering flag with a pointed or rounded tail. So this was definitely more connected to that sense of going back and forth and being easier to follow than simply the banner that had become more squared and simply to identify was essentially the base from which the troops in the unit would start to fight from, and then going back and forth. And so the standard was somehow more out there and more easily identifiable, also in this more difficult situations. And this is fascinating as well, because it gives you an idea of the relative staticization of warfare at this point compared to before. It is true that in the late Middle Ages there is an increase in more positionary warfare. It is true that there is some kind of more attritional fight on the battlefield. There are still the big battles with, again, the various battle lines in depth, etc. That doesn't quite end. But overall, warfare is becoming a bit about more this fragmentation of back and forth of men-at-arms and their retinues, that are still, however, considered as truly effective and articulated mini units that must also coordinate each other through these ensigns, rather than the principle of the force, the brute force that could exist, I don't know, at the same time, but I don't know, in the 11th century, for a Norman knight storming a moat with his retinue, in a much less sophisticated way. This really is a point you should never really forget about these times and places. That, again, armies towards the end of the Middle Ages actually became smaller, right? Before the introduction of pike squares, naturally were made up of people that were much less costly individually compared to the men-at-arms that were also, for this reason, being knocked out by this greater collective effort against them. But up until that point, actually, you see that, think about the importance of fortifications, of cities that are also heavily fortified from the mid-14th century onwards in an unprecedented way. Armies are getting smaller, so think about how bigger that fortification was overall, and so how much more sort of needs of infiltrations of coups, etc., rather than big operations were entailed. With an increasing articulation on a type of specialties, because the men-at-arms are getting ever heavier, so they need literally either specialized functional troops, not just yet another knight next to them, as it had arrived to be through the gradual heavening of the squires up to the 13th century. You have the archer, you have the gunner, there's artillery around. It's all massier than that. So this sort of stepping further of the standard in these circumstances, especially as a banner, you had to as a flag you had to follow during combat, right? As opposed to the banner that was just now more representative. I think is quite telling about very telling about the nature of late medieval warfare. Having said this, however, both banner and standard were the rallying points of a particular lord or knight's own following. Right. This played essentially the same role as the colors of later European regular armies, as we were remembering before, and involving the honor of those who fought under them in exactly the same way. Right. On medieval battlefield, as you know, I specialize in the first half of the 14th century, mostly late 13th, and of course there's plenty of different ways to rally somewhere, right? Sometimes trees on the battlefield somewhere, because everything is much more messed up than it sounds. Units at some point are crushed, they unite with others, some guys get lost, etc. Reconstructing what the battlefields actually were in terms of, I don't know, bushes, edges, trees, streams, it's not always easy. I made a video about exactly the Battle of Poitiers, 1356, that is quite illustrative of this. For the rest, being actually a very beautiful battle, and one that really tells you what the whole thing was about, and that was also a big one, so but not the norm compared to the to the dynamics that surely had shaped the same use of these flags, right? For other occasion. Without saying, the loss of banners, standards, etc. was looked upon as a grave dishonor. There is this episode of Henry Percy's standard, which was captured by the Scots at Newcastle, leading to a vain bid at its recovery that resulted in the disastrous English defeat at the Battle of Otterburn, where in 1388. And interestingly enough, the council that had prudently looked at the thing before, at least a part of those who had taken part in it, had gotten to the conclusion that it was, quote, better to lose a pennon than 200 or 300 knights, right? And you see here 200 or 300 knights, which is a bit like the average of a serious disaster, but also not on a big scale battle like it would have been. By the scale of that disaster, sometimes again, think Poitiers for the French, like a much bigger deal, right? So we're talking about we are at the end of the 14th century, a more compact reality. The English knight John Chandos, displaying his banner for the first time before the Battle of Navarre, handed it to his men and said, quote, "Behold here my banner and yours, guard it as your own." Right? So this meant what we're looking at before. There is really a lot to do in this battle, and these leaders were involved pretty much first hand. You know that Chandos was killed in combat 9 years later, if I remember correctly. Also taking to the grave the other guy, by the way. And this tells you, of course, how incredibly dangerous, risky, violent, brutal, and always sort of Russian roulette this whole thing was. Doesn't matter how powerful, how elite, how well armored, etc. People kill each other, right? At all these levels, as we've seen, even of status. Thus, the necessity of preserving the banner in a condition in which you had to be focused on lots of other things, and leaders really had, right? Chiefs were to look at like properly the entire battlefield and have this coup d'oeil and calibrating carefully every kind of moral or physical pressure to try to focus in this incredibly difficult situation that is really the most difficult one in which to operate in the first place. And so the banner in this case was better in the hands of someone else, and of people, of course, that here are very say loyal to him, like, and they're trustworthy in fighting alongside him at the same time, right? Risking your banner, your standard was always a thing, right? Units go into battle with that, and exactly because of that, meaning that you could not have this unit without having, of course, the spirit keeping it together through this symbol, right? And so everything was, of course, a matter of moral superiority. It's not just about the seeing the banner, knowing that your unit is there, but is also realizing what you're fighting for, right? Where or not. Incredibly bloody ties of fealty, of promotion, because this was all a business, as you understand. And the same Chandos was a guy essentially came up from a essentially obscure landed gentry, like it made it to the top, being a friend of the Black Prince, having all these titles in Aquitaine, Poitou, in Normandy. So one of the most interesting figures of the 100 Years' War from the English side. And this statement says it all. Of course, it's paraphrased. We don't know whether he literally said this, but that's obviously something that we know comparatively, being pretty much what these men-at-arms were into, conceptually. Guard is your own, and the story says that they took it and said that this guy took the banner and said, with the grace of God and St. George, the patron of knights, they would keep it and defend it to the utmost of their ability. Then soon after, the Englishmen and Gascons dismounted, and each man drew up in array of battle and under their own banner and standard, ready to fight. Right, so of course the leaders here were involved in lining up as well, choosing the man in the formation, etc. So somebody else had to keep the banner. It's incredibly important to stress here how much, of course, attention there was even towards the literal energy spending. Right, keeping a banner is also, as we've seen, a matter of prowess, because you have to literally fight with that in one hand and the sword or whatever in the other. And so it's just an extra thing, right? They're not excessively heavy, of course, but because nobody on the battlefield would have been, but definitely the guy who had to bear them was not a common one, exactly because he also had to support this extra weight and fighting with something that is really not, say, as functional, say, as a shield, for example. Right, they could have, of course, a shield in their hands, some sort of, and holding the banner as well, but it's still an extra that you add furthermore, and it's just like a huge pole that you are essentially also to always keep straight, visible, etc. So however you feel like, whatever, you have to just maintain it. And of course different men could do it, like this quote seems to suggest, at a different time. It was also a shared role duty, but it's obvious, especially on horseback, right? It was a guy that, say, the nature of cavalry charges, depending on how they were still about, either we break at the first impact, so it's not just literally the guy that holds the banner that makes the thing done, it's the order of the formation and everything. But at least, again, in order also to maintain formation, you have to have the spanners in the first line. You have to, these guys orienting themselves through them. There were some rot masters that were master of horses that were keeping the line, riding back and forth, slower, faster, shouting to those who were going too fast or too slow, etc. So it was a very delicate moment. And there was also a sort of scenographic purpose of these flags, because they, of course, were beautiful to watch. Right? Again, the visual dimension in this, the artistry, the symbolism, etc., was all one with that. These guys had their own coat of arms with their own intrinsic meaning within them, different colors, different symbols, different functions. It was them living essentially in those flags that were definitely reaching God, heaven, right? So that's quite important overall. So the banner and the standard, right? You often find these terms also in Latin, for example, the banderia, the bania. There are different types of calling, especially the banner. And when you look at that, you know that that's a prerogative, right? It's not, say, the bannerets were above also other, say, company commanders of some sort. Like, the hierarchy could vary widely as far as how also these units were put together, say, on a battle line, because everything was done in very ad hoc, at the moment sort of thing, right? Most medieval armies were coalition forces of some sort, so you had units coming from very far away that didn't really have too much in common, except they essentially fought more or less all in the same way. So you could merge them together, but this sense that you were the guy who arrived with a company that bore your insignia, and that was in this sense yours, right? To a degree of privilege that identified your functions politically, say also in the, say, non-military dimension. It was a huge deal of status, of prestige, of power. And just working, for example, on an article talking about a guy who was an imperial ambassador at Avignon, the papal curia, who was from Lorraine essentially, but received a fief by the king of the Romans in Swabia and fought in Italy and then came back to Germany. That's quite a thing. This guy had his own banner in battle. It's something that you don't even meet so frequently. Like some, of course, this also depends on the countries and how also they all intended this privilege. Because I was saying before, it was a privilege, but say the sense of categorization regarding it was not so immediately uniform as we could think, right? So we will see perhaps better in other videos, trying to be more say exemplificative at least. So it's obvious that when you look at the 100 Years' War, France and England, they're a bit like the most feudally, let's say, compacted and somehow culturally organized, right? Countries in these feudal dynastic heraldic matters, and so they embody a bit like the blood and soul of that feudal Europe in these terms. But in other countries, it was not fully like that, right? It was all sometimes either way more primitive and so much less, say, categorized and hierarchized like than it usually though. And it depends what the background of these knights were, which country, which place, which city, say, what kind of power, right, and all this type of stuff. Then there were other types of flags, obviously, that were all part of this broader hierarchy, and that were still essentially showing that sort of status level that was associated to the commander who was ruling this unit. For example, the pennon, right, together with its that is really ubiquitous, right? And we're not talking knights just, right? Here we talk again for the sake of example, mostly French, English examples. You have knights, right? But the pennon was used also by infantry very often. Like you have the pennoncelle as well. This doesn't see the sense is that it would be a type of flag, long, narrow, tapering, right? That you see also, for example, on ships, right? Because troops on board really looked like in the same way. Acting as marines, they were deployed as if on the ship's deck, as if they had been just like on a castle rampart, right? So, or on the battlefield for that matter. So the pennon was used definitely as a sort of a heraldic device to represent a person or family, but it could be used just to indicate, I don't know, a subunit of a company, of a guild of, I don't know, of smiths of a commune, right? So the degree by which they were organized did vary, because every place had also different kind of organic. That's also what I describe in the videos about the army organization. Organic varied wildly. It depended on different cultural influxes, just even historically so, etc. And today we do not talk about organics, numbers, etc., but you understand the hierarchical order here. Of course, the leader, the commander-in-chief, the king, the emperor had the largest, right, banner ever there, because it was meant all to work. Like, for example, musical instruments. I made multiple videos about military music were conceived in the same way. You have essentially the bigger drum that is the one used to line up soldiers across the entire army, and you have the small area unit having. This is underestimated, especially in Western Europe, how military music was actually developed, even though we don't have too much for evidence compared to the Easterners, for example. In any case, this was the Pennon cell. Then there was the Guidon, that seemingly was a smaller version of the standard with a pointed tail. All of these typologies could be made of silk or some other fine material, depending on whomever was bearing them, right? Of course, with some expense, but it was not just the most expensive thing ever compared to a set of armor, etc. So if you had that, you could naturally have all these flags very very preciously decorated, made in the first place. Then you have the ensign, right? Likewise, seemingly a smaller version or a variant of the standard. We don't understand further. It was used as perhaps of rank sort of function, but it's not necessarily it either. Then you have the fork-tailed gonfalon remaining in use. This was employed, in fact, also in the previous centuries as a banner suspended from a crossbar or frame. You've seen it on the Bayeux tapestry, for example. Usually it had streamers attached from the bottom end of the crossbar, and it was still around, of course. It should be noted, by the way, that all these terms, again, were considerably misused, not just mixed, right, but properly misunderstood also by some contemporary chroniclers that are frequently to be found misapplied in the sources, right? So in part we have seen there was no linear categorization regarding these terms. The typologies could also somehow resemble each other, but it was also genuine approximation, mistake, misuse, whatever, in the definition of such terms. Another thing that is perspectively interesting is the fact that when the banners or the standards were viewed from the reverse, of course the entire design would reverse itself. This has maybe some minor implication and was not the big deal. Again, the standard affirmed itself mostly, showing the colors of the leader, also with some mottos on to be a bit more characterized, customized, to bypass the complexity of what, again, all the various incredibly complex sometimes coat of arms that could be depicted, to be misunderstood, equivocated, unrecognized, right? So the sense is that even if you flip that or whatever, it was probably not that important in the first place. And this is a bit the broad picture. Of course, we could say so many things about this. This is just a very introductory video telling you the truth that I make for the sake of completion, talking about aspects of medieval warfare that one may say, well, why is this important or not? Because when you look, at least as I was saying before, when you study sources of battle, combat, etc., you often get infos about, say, the units depending on the type of banner, right? Because it's not entirely clear. You think, I don't know, there is an early 14th century army, more or less we know everything about it, right? Basic things such as how many troops were under this kind of flag, right, organically, and what was the entire hierarchy about completely. You would think we know that, right? We actually don't. We don't have a type of source that clearly indicates the whole set. By saying, look, here it's from the top to bottom all the type of banner of flags that exist, and let's say this is what the organic corresponds to accordingly. There is no such source in medieval times. There is no, let's say, of course, the more, how do we get to know these things? Because accidentally, one source, one chronicle, is saying, I don't know, there were so many Pennon cells when the enemy arrived that the guys from the other side could count how many troops there were, because they knew that under any Pennon cell there were 25 men. And it doesn't even tell you how many Pennon cells there were. By the way, it would solve the problem of at least how many there were actually there. But you see how it works in the mind of the medieval author. They just don't care to tell you, because it's as if everybody had known that. And maybe he points that out and doesn't come out in the entire chronicle, or maybe not even in others, because for that place, for that region, whatever, because they were fairly standardized, even across Europe again, because the organic naturally stems from some human-based sort of systems of measurement that, especially in Western Europe, are very relatively homogeneous, not very, but still for medieval times they really are. But he thought it was obvious, right? There was no need to stress this info, that's the number for all this. Also because, by the way, the armies varied in size dramatically, in the sense that, yes, these forces were all normally at the base, as we were saying, subdivided more or less in the standard type of unit bases, like the decimal system is, say, 25 man, 50, 100. That's likely to be the basic organization of the smallest units. But the smallest units in that sense are small units that are not the ones who are going to make the broad difference in tactics. It is going to be made mostly by the battle lines and how the alternating combat and all this stuff. So if you have, 3,000 men that arrive as a reinforcement of a force of, 15,000, or you don't, you have considerable change in measure, and nobody will care effectively about those smaller units that would make up the bigger chunks that really matter in battle, up to thousands of knights at a time. And that's pretty much it. Who cares legitimately, even for reconstructing those battles in a hierarchical fashion, how large these things were? And at that point, of such a famous display, like the fact that he who commanded the battle was, of course, accompanied by these ensign bearers, and they had that specific function, and it was obvious because that's the only thing that existed in the world. We are in the Middle Ages. Those are the top military that existed. It functions pretty much everywhere in the civilized world. Again, yes, there are different cultures, different systems, etc., but pretty much, again, in Western Europe, we're talking the same thing. So, you, as a researcher, come to put together all this info, and you kind of guess, right, on the basis of what you have seen being the number of the battle lines, how many subunits you ever see doing something else more actively, and that's the size of a company. And then the company is made up of these guys, with the smaller ensigns that sometimes are referred to like that. And then you can look at other times in history, like even our own, these standard organic levels that more or less are about the same amount of band throughout history. And you start even filling the gaps, naturally with all the adequate precautions, because we don't have, in fact, that explicit evidence. But of course, that is largely going to make sense, right? That is largely going to tell you, well, yeah, that's how probably so homogeneous these armies were, because you evidently see it from this proportion, that you understand what was the tactical function of that troops, and you realize that abroad it wouldn't differ fundamentally from it. That you understand also why the source wouldn't tell you, right? The same goes for the indenture or the condottas, etc. In the documents, you hardly find this information. Towards the later Middle Ages, of course, you know more, because evidence really accumulates. You start having really registers, bureaucracy. You have more permanent troops. That's also a thing, because you start seeing, maybe you will learn incidentally that, these banners were used because, one is searching for the cloth for making that, and how many were created for a given amount of troops, how many were spare, how many were used. So it's a very complex game. I've never really gotten into it, because never really studied banners unless in function of the this organic issue that is mostly answered by the numbers given to the units rather than the type of banner. But that also helps to understand, again, how more or less standardized they were. And of course, it was a specific functionality. Then we've seen it in many other videos, like the ones on the 30 Years' War or the Modern Warfare. You realize that there were brand new units, at least in terms of name, that simply derived from the fact that the say their equivalent was under strength, to the point that those smaller chunks came to be to make up this bigger one that sometimes was not even as big as the one that it should have been, the sum of all these what they should have been, right, individually, if they had been full strength put together. So it's that somehow twisted. But if you had seen it from the battlefield operationally, etc., and administratively, you would immediately understand why it was like that, because it was kind of the most obvious, natural, practical thing in the world at that point. So it's that's really how you proceed, right? You don't really go that's the things that you may read on a book. We don't really know. It's a problem to know. It's a problem. But if you make the effort of, say, writing, I don't know, a doctoral thesis, or getting to this sort of twisted thing of listing actual quantities of stuff, right, of data, you start having at that point, not selecting just a source or another, as de facto lazily academy teaches you to do, to skip the necessity of having a comprehensive understanding that is also the one giving you the actual quality capacity. Well, you can never picture in your mind how concrete that thing really is, and how relatively easy actually to find out it is once you have the data and you can simply browse them, right? So it's really there. Of course, we will talk about the various flags of places like Central, Northern, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and also the other, say, the Islamic powers, etc. So, as we will see, there are lots of parallelisms, but also differences, mostly in the sources and in the way we get the information, the quantity of that mostly tells us a lot about that culture, and so that moral dimension rather than the this technical one that at the end of the day is not even the single most important thing, right? Honestly, about banners and standards, archaeologically speaking, I can say I don't care anything about, but say, as a military historian, at least that's the least important thing that I can think of, or at least one of the least important. I would be fascinated. I don't know. I would love to have seen them. I love to have even handed one, but that would be amazing. But the most amazing thing is this comprehensive art of war awareness that comes only, gets down to how these armies actually fought, which is, again, not much of a technical, sort of abstract, mechanistic process. It's how literally they made this world mass of man. So this moral and physical tide work orderly on a battlefield, and making these people knowing what to do, and making them do it in the most effective, orderly, and cohesive, functional fashion as possible. And that, I think, is the most interesting thing, and it requires also much more sensitivity in the measure in which you have to. That there is even less about that, except battle accounts that are just the stories of this battle. And paradoxically, you tend to get more from that because it's much more human and deep and, let's say, psychological than the mechanical aspect. I make also these videos about arms and armors and stuff because they're objectively interesting. I mean, it's beautiful to have all this list of knights from various countries and generations say, oh, look, this guy looked like this like that, and you compare what is mostly in common, what differs, and you can throw some info about this. But in fact, the interesting aspect is to understand them, to realize how much bigger the picture was, right, and to in fact drive away from this sort of individualistic one versus one, or what kind of weapon, who would win between an army equipped with this weapon, or you still have actual people, actual adult humans formulating these questions disproportionately on channels with millions of subscribers that deal with HEMA or reenactment, whatever, and these are the actual questions, right? And that's honestly embarrassing, right? And it tells you how far we are from a popular, comprehensive, moral, and scientific dignity about humanity, about history, about the world. And that's why I also take all this time, because you say, well, what do you do it for? Right? Are you making this video hoping to make, I don't know, some money with this specifically? No, I do it to show the bigger purpose. It's as if all these videos were old soldiers that, just like we are here, like everyone here is making their part to a broader purpose, that you must train, you must discipline, you must inform people in order to see it done, which is not easy at all, right? And it can be really, really challenging. It really is. It's the most difficult thing. But in theory, but in practice, I mean, it's also the thing that if you do properly, is going to bring you more far, because it's going to have a greater reach. It's going to be more, it's telling more about itself and not merely being, I don't know, what's the worst sword that exists. Or also one of the things that, honestly, I was looking here in a completely accidental way about a feud between two of these actually big names of this various sort of channels dealing with this topic, and of which is, the most bizarre word. What happens if I do this with this word? Would I do that? And it's actually far from any dramatic amount of sophistication, telling the truth. I mean, even if I were an apologist, I would be horrified with the sense these topics are dealt with. And technically, some of these people are even some of the most knowledgeable in practice, right? What I don't have anything against apology. Actually, I wish I knew much more about it, which I do, because I also, in part, right, learned my own deal with this, and sometimes I don't have never made an exam on this, never written an article on this, whatever. But of course, exactly for that, I accumulated some knowledge that, even though less formal, is still, I think, valuable. And here and there I talk about arms and armor too. But the thing, you see these feuds starting because you realize these people started essentially a YouTube channel to make money. It's fine. But they engaged into, first of all, the audience's sort of weirdest desires, questions, misconceptions that were also, in fact, answered, addressed correctly. But also in the sense chased after, as if, let's make just what people ask us, but let's not actually make something that goes beyond and that is more qualitative and is more moral in a way, right? And then you discover these people clash against one another because they suddenly, maybe they work for 10 years together, but then they discover, when they finally meet, that they're very different ideologically. And that's something that as a historian has always bewildered me, that is to say, how is it possible? I mean, literally, if you are a historian, understanding the political view of a person through their historical interest is the single most basic thing ever, right? You read in people's minds. It's beautiful. It takes nothing, right, to do so. And it somehow dawned on me that the reason why they didn't have any clue is because they don't actually make history. They make something that is based on their respectable personal experience with weapons, with him, etc., but that do not get more far when it gets to something obviously and necessarily a little more complex than that, right? And I doubt enormously of the heuristic value of this content, but of the actual righteousness of these activities. Because if your point is fueling what people just want to feel comforted by, I understand it's the internet, that's what people come here for, but you're never going to make them grow. I mean, the best investment that is a long-term one you can draw from these people is going to be lost completely. You're just going to pollute an already culturally diseased society with lots of notions that will just echo in the simplistic term because they're based not on what you can bring forward, but as a sort of just where most people stop to, right? This is not even a specific criticism of specific channels that are really doing their job, and that I'm not interested in criticizing for that. But when they actually explain the deal, but in the moment in which they don't move forward, in the moment in which they remain stuck with that sort of tantrum that doesn't quite, it's spent, it's exhausted, right? I try with my videos, even though I talk, and exactly because I talk very much in detail, which means very much in terms of complexity, to always keep it fresh, and vary it. And in this sense, even when I make entire playlists about a given topic, still making it about different stuff, making it about different info, knowledge, etc., and building something ever bigger and more complex and valuable and expandable, etc. So that's really my objective. Well, this was a bit of a final digression, but every once in a while I increase, let's say, the length when I suspect, because I never want to be under the hour as a video, for reasons I'm not going to explain now, but I guess I surpassed it for today. Thus I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.